Hey everyone, in our previous video, you learned about implicit biases and levels of racism. In this video, we're going to dive in a little deeper about the levels of racism and systemic racism as well. Let's start with systemic racism. Our world is almost entirely based on race. Systemic racism is racism that is embedded in the system of our society. It can include things like unequal health care, police brutality, housing insecurity, and racial wealth gap. Systems that can harm racial groups, in other words, perpetrate racism. Systemic racism can have an effect on health and can also play a part in crimes, housing, voting rights, and education. And according to benandjerry.com, Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students, even when their infractions or violations were similar. Now we're going to watch a short clip of a video in which white people talk about their experiences with race.
One of my third grade students seemed pretty rocked after the Eric Garner case or death, and came up to me and said, why, when you were little, were you worried about this stuff too? And I knew what he was talking about before. I mean, I didn't say, what do you mean, what stuff? I didn't want to, play dumb. And I said, no, I didn't have to be. And that's not fair. And that was really hard because he just kind of sat there, and it honestly seemed like the first time that he had considered the fact that not everyone had to think about race all the time.
So after watching that clip, now we're going to talk more about levels of racism, which were introduced in our previous video. The 4 levels of racism are personal racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. Let's go through each one. Internalized or personal racism. This is racism that lies within individuals' personal beliefs and prejudices. An example of this is a person who thinks that a minority group is considered lesser than. The next one is interpersonal racism. This is the expression of racism between individuals. For example, this would be a person saying that a minority group is lesser than, instead of just thinking. The next level is institutional racism. This is discriminatory treatment, policies, or practices within an organization or institution. And a simple example of this is workplace discrimination, where either employees or managers are being treated unfairly because of their race. And the last level of racism here is structural racism, which is racial bias among institutions and across society, public policies that systematically disadvantage people of color. These institutional practices and norms perpetuate racial group inequality. An example of this is the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And if you don't know what that is, it was a racially discriminatory act signed by President Reagan, and as a result, African Americans were sentenced to jail for 5 years using 5 grams of a certain drug, and white Americans were punished the same for using 500 grams of the same drug, meaning that African Americans were jailed at a 100 times higher rate than white Americans. So hopefully you learned something in this video, and after watching this video, don't forget to watch our next video.